Start. All right, you're live.
Okay, folks, if we could
Flowers and cornmeal on the way back home. So she wanted to go back with that.
appreciate all of you coming out on a dark and rainy day. It's a little harder to get out when you got to get through the rain and all that. And at least not all of you went for the drop slip that I mentioned at the end of the hour last time. I have handouts from last time. If anybody else missed and would like to hand out from lesson number 1, did I catch everybody as you came in? Okay, and of course, my trusted TA Larry has gotten out all the handouts for number 2, right? All right, logistical matters out of the way then. Do we have any other logistical matters or format matters or business that we need to take up since we're still in the game starting? Well, in the way of cleanup from last time, I heard back from several of you with both remarks and questions, and I always enjoy that and appreciate you taking the time. I did get one correction, so I've got to clean up. I was talking when my brain wasn't quite engaged at one point, apparently, when I was setting the stage for both the impact of COVID and the impact of the civil unrest attendant the Minneapolis, Minnesota incident. I am told I used the name of Michael Brown in that sentence, and that's not correct, of course. It was George Floyd, and the reason I got off mentally, just making my excuses here, is I have been reading and editing a research paper on the death of Michael Brown, who was the young Black man in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And I had all that stuff somewhere floating around back there from having read and worked on editing that paper that's been submitted for this Simon Review series that I edit and that we do out of Paul Simon Institute. So sometimes things just float out in the wrong sentence, but correction on that, errata, if you had gotten the paper and found a mistake, don't hesitate to let me know. Raise your hand and say, no, it was George Floyd. Anything else of that note? Did we take care of all the questions last time? Otherwise, I even heard from Zoom land out there. Glad to hear from those folks out there in the second section. I am going to go back to where we were last time because I didn't quite get through with all that I wanted to talk about. Right at the end of the hour, we were talking about what is, I think, probably the major problem, most fundamental problem that we as a country and a society have, and that is, what is truth and how do you establish what is truth and what are facts and what is fake news and what is propaganda as opposed to real news and real facts. And we had just opened that when I decided to quit, but I have 2 slides left over from last time and a little bit of 3 pages worth of discussions. And you can't write this stuff without delivering it at that point. So I want to go back as a postscript to last time, but it's really very relevant to what we want to do today. There's nothing more fundamental really facing us as a challenge than that we as a polarized nation apparently live in 2 different worlds, 2 different realities, and people will not accept the other side's take on what are facts and what are real news as opposed to alternate facts, as a famous person once said about the other way of looking at the world. And as I mentioned, those of us in education, which includes most of this room, I think have to be concerned about what have we done in terms of teaching the philosophy of science in a way that people understand. There are norms about how the scientific method works, for example. What is the medical fact? What's the true story about the COVID vaccine, for example? And that has driven the society to have now almost 900,000 people dead to some extent because we couldn't get our act together. It should have never been polarized. It was partisan and polarized almost from the beginning. And it literally was a life and death kind of an outcome in terms of public policy made and not observed, and controversies over which state had the right policies and so forth. So I'm going to start out with that handout, which was number 6 last time, Gary, as you know. Yes, thank you, right there. Partisan divisions related to both the January 6th assault and the 2020 presidential election color nearly every issue raised in the survey, referring here to the Washington Post poll that I've got cited there. From how much violence occurred at the Capitol that day to the severity of the sentences handed down to convicted protesters to whether President Biden was legitimately elected. It's kind of like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, if you have doubts about what happened at the Capitol that day, it seems to me. The percentage of Americans who say that violent action against the government is justified at times stands at 34%, according to this poll. And that's considerably higher than past polls that the Post had done. And the Post has been surveying this for over 2 decades. And it's just become heavily partisan. The new survey, however, finds that 40% of Republicans, 41% of independents, and 23% of Democrats say that violence against the government is sometimes justified, going back to what we were talking about the last time about the role of violence and whether or not I'm sorry.
Could you repeat that set of numbers?
Yeah, the survey found that 40% of Republicans, 41% of independents, and 23% of Democrats say that violence, the use of violence, is sometimes justified. In addition, overall, 60% of Americans say that Donald Trump bears either a great deal or a good amount of the responsibility for what happened on January the 6th. 72% of Republicans and 83% of Trump voters say he had just some or no responsibility at all. People living in 2 different worlds, it seems to me. So this Post University of Maryland survey finds that 68% of Americans say that there is no solid evidence of widespread fraud. 30% say there is. Now, a quick aside on that, the facts I mentioned last time, there were more than 60 court cases filed across the country trying to establish whether or not the count was right or there was widespread fraud. And only one of them got a hearing, and it was predicated on a procedural matter. Nobody else in any of the courts, state or federal, found evidence of fraud at anything like a widespread number that would be required to make any difference. I thought the best study that came out of that was done by the Associated Press. It got almost no publicity, but the Associated Press, after this really became a thing after the January 6th insurrection or demonstration or whichever you want to call it, they did a very careful study of the 6 pivotal battleground states. and they studied 25.5 million votes cast in those 6 states, which is where the election was won and lost. AP has deep and historic tradition and credentials for doing this because AP are the people that always keep people in the field, keep them studying what's coming in that night so they can make the call, so the media can make the call. We've been doing that for generations. The Associated Press is as neutral and as good a source as you can get in these things. Out of 25.5 million ballots, they went back and studied carefully. This came out like 2 months later. They found a grand total of 475 cases where there may have been illegal voting. 475 over 25.5 million. And I can tell you, people like AP and political scientists have been studying these things at state level, national level for decades, and they always come out that way, without exception. You take huge numbers, you go back and redo them, they come out with a handful of people. Her name changed because she got married. One case that was legitimately wrong was a guy voted his wife's ballot after she had died, and he thought she'd voted that way. I mean, the examples are just human error, and they don't amount to a hill of beans. And political scientists and journalists have been doing this at huge data level for a long time, and we do it very well in this country. It's remarkable because it's so decentralized, it's so localized, there's so many county clerks involved, there's so many election judges involved. It's amazing that we do it this well, but we do. And as Bill Barr said, it was no exception in 2020. So I'm establishing what I would assert to be the facts of the matter. Continuing on, about 7 in 10 Americans, are we still with that one? Yeah. About 7 in 10 Americans say that Biden's election as president was legitimately, but that leaves 3 in 10 who say it was not. 58% of Republicans said and still say that Biden was not legitimately elected. This is down a little bit from the first survey the Post did when 70% said that Biden was not legitimately elected. So that fight goes on. Among those who say that they voted for Trump in 2020, 69% say that Biden was not legitimately elected. Not surprisingly, 97% of Biden voters say that he was legitimately elected. So you've got the summary. No, I don't think you have a summary. I'll read it to you. They summarize at the end of this article. 2 decades ago, Republicans and Democrats were uniform in their pride in democracy, with more than 9 in 10 in each party expressing positive views about our democracy. In 2017, a partisan divide opened up clearly, with Republicans at that time more positive than Democrats about whether or not they are proud of American democracy. However, Republicans and Democrats are closer together on this one thing in the survey, because 4 in 10 of both parties say they are not now proud of the way our democracy works. That's that question of whether or not we are to be emulated in the rest of the world that I tried to bring to you last time. So that in a nutshell is public opinion polls dealing with the electoral process, dealing with the legitimacy of the new administration, dealing with the question of whether or not the president can actually have a mandate to govern because he won fair and square. You remember the old honeymoon that presidents were supposed to get for at least a little while. And again, what really happened in that election. And can we make that transfer of power peacefully that we've been proud of since 1800, as I talked about last time. So quickly, that is mass view. I want to move quickly on this wrap up to the elite level. Who are the leaders? What are they saying? Who are the opinion leaders? What are the media opinion elites and so forth? There, the picture is much worse. The picture is that there are deep racial, regional, partisan differences, philosophical differences that have only gotten deeper. And I taught public opinion for a lot of years. We generally teach in a public opinion course that elite opinion leads mass opinion and shapes mass opinion. Not every time, but most of the time, that's the way it works. So this is even sort of more dire in terms of their response at the elite level. And at the congressional level, you could put this as state legislative level and be true as well, but at the congressional level, what we call party line voting is now at historic highs and has been historically more divided now than in any past history of American government. That's what Ornstein and Mann were talking about in that book that I mentioned to you last time, where they summarized and said the situation in the Congress, it is even worse than you think. I mentioned that book last time. A quick telling generalization, if you can envision this, the most conservative member of the US Senate, not surprisingly Joe Manchin, and these roll call studies that political scientists do is more liberal than the most liberal Republican senator, two senators. Lisa Murkowski is of course one of those, and Susan Collins is the other. Tom.
Would you say that again?
The most, I hope I said it right, the most conservative Democrat, Joe Manchin, is more liberal than the two most liberal Republican senators. The old bell-shaped curve used to overlap, doesn't overlap. Take, for example, Kinzinger and Cheney.
Right.
They are fierce anti-Trump people, but they are extraordinarily conservative in their voting behavior. So that just illustrates the point even more graphically, it seems to me. Slide 7, is that where we are? Thank you. He's better than radar. Lisa. I used that with a young secretary that we had newly hired in our office. I told her she was just as good as radar, and she said, "What? Did you just call me a dog or something?" Boy, that dates you if you don't know who Radar from MASH was. Anyway, Lisa Muscard wrote this from AP News, again, a good source. She says, a deeply divided Congress is about to show the world a very unsettled view of the US Capitol. Rather than a national crisis that pulls the country together, the deadly riot on January the 6th, 2021, only seems to have pushed the lawmakers further apart. She then goes on to document what they did in the Congress on January the 6th. And the House decided that the House and Senate decided over on the House side, they held the hearings, not really hearings, but they had a formal session where they went into formal session and they talked about what happened exactly the year before and what it meant and what the implications were and how serious it was. And two Republicans showed up. Dick Cheney and his daughter came, which was really remarkable that Dick Cheney actually showed up. Liz Cheney and her dad were there, and that was it on the Republican side. And the rest of the Republicans said, there's nothing to see here. We're not going to be backdrop for this Democratic charade. She concludes, routine disputes over ordinary issues in Congress can quickly devolve into menacing threats as happened in the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed, where several Republican lawmakers who voted for it started receiving violent messages, including death threats, for having voted for what was a bipartisan bill that even Mitch McConnell voted for crying out loud. That's just how charged with emotion and threats and all kinds of craziness. The two Republicans on the House panel, I've already mentioned them, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, have faced calls that they be banished from their leadership, which Liz Cheney was, and from the caucus itself. They've been censured by the Republican National Committee for their participation on the January 6th committee. The RNC, as many of you may remember, put out a press release which said that January 6th was, quote, ordinary Americans engaged in legitimate political discourse, unquote. Mitch Romney and Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney basically responded to that and said, no, that's not what it was. They both put out statements saying it was not legitimate discourse. It was not ordinary citizens that we were seeing on Capitol Hill that day. So is this going to continue on? Probably so. We're going to get to later what may happen if we have a change in government on January the 8th or 9th next year, and the Republicans take back the House and Senate. And in anticipation of that, I saw an interview on television this weekend. Chuck Grassley, as some of you know, the senator from Iowa, been there forever. He was talking to a Republican or to a reporter and talking about the Republican takeover, which he believes is absolutely going to happen. And he has been working with, I believe it's Senator Warner, trying to get a bill on the limitation of prescription drug prices. He's had a bill, they've gotten it through 2 or 3 times on the House side. They can't get it out of the Senate. And Grassley said, I hope the Democrats will pass this thing because it ain't going anywhere come January, which I thought was really a great admission of how things are going to be when things change and if they change come next January. Okay, so the fight for what happened in 2020 goes on. The interpretation of January the 6th goes on. I'm going to discuss in the rest of the time that I have, and then Suzanne will come up after me. I'm going to discuss some practical things that might be worthwhile, that are certainly driving much of the problem in terms of what this means to our politics and how this reflects, especially the partisan polarization of our politics. There are some clear electoral and campaign-oriented procedural problems that really prevent majority rule. And if you define democracy as majority rule, then we don't get it. We don't have it because these rules magnify the minority versus majority rule concept. The leading candidates in our political science terms for this are the Electoral College and the structure of the US Senate. Both of those promote the possibility and the reality oftentimes of not getting majority rule and not being able to pass policy into law with the majority vote. The leading candidate for playing this role in the House rather than the Senate is reapportionment, redistricting, and the deeply partisan reapportionment process that we have in many states of this country. So I'm going to cover both of those. I'm not going to do anything with the Electoral College and the structure of the Senate because they are structural parts of the Constitution. I don't think those are going to change. So I'm going to go on to what I think are more practical considerations, and that starts with the filibuster. As slide number 1 of lesson number 2, is that where we are? Slide number 1, lesson number 2. It's only a rule of the Senate. It's not in the Constitution. It is not a law in the sense that we think about laws. It's a rule of the Senate that the Senate can change anytime. And indeed, it has been changed 3 times. It was changed under the leadership of Indiana Senator Birch Bayh in 1975, where they went from 67 votes, which it had been, down to 60. That means we went from 3/4 to 3/5 of the vote majority. The Senate likes to call itself, quote, the world's greatest deliberative body. They're never short on ego in the Senate. I have some doubts about that. I always have had. I would say House of Commons might take umbrage to that, for example. If you've ever seen, I think it's Thursday morning, where the prime minister has to go in every week and stand before them, and they have that jousting. That's real give and take and deliberation. The filibuster is such a travesty now, and that's why I want to try to untangle it as we go through this. It was changed again in 2013 by the Democrats. They used what is called the nuclear option, and there had been debate about it for a long time. The Democrats under Harry Reid decided that Obama had to get some of his federal judges unclogged in the system and had to get some executive agencies with permanent leadership, because the Republicans had refused to hold hearings and had refused a whole bunch of those, any decision one way or the other. So the Democrats reduced the number from 60 to 51, not across the board on all appointments, but on federal judges, but only appellate and district court federal judges at that time. Determined Republican opposition, they lost, but to nobody's surprise, when Mitch McConnell got back in, he changed the rule to apply to Supreme Court justices for the first time in 2017. And that precipitated the so-called, as Democrats call it, stolen seat problem that they're still mad about on the Democratic side, when Mitch changed it to 51 votes. And he got, of course, Merrick Garland did ever get to hearing, and the replacement for Anton Scalia got all tangled up, and they wound up basically getting the appointment for President Trump when he came into office. The filibuster has traditionally been used only sparingly in most of its history, not for these kinds of fights that we're now more familiar with. It was almost exclusively in the past used by the South to stop civil rights legislation and to stop pro-labor union legislation. And the senators, the old heads, the old bulls in the Senate side from the South used it very, very skillfully. There was only one civil rights bill come out of the Senate in 100 years practically, and that was Lyndon Johnson actually in 57 let one fairly watered down bill go because he wanted to get at least some other Northern and other Western Democrats involved. And so there was only one civil rights bill in that whole period of time. This, of course, then became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Civil Rights Act of 1965. There was a deep conflict over particularly the 64 Civil Rights Act. It was a great spectacle. I happened to be working on the Hill at the time, used to go over every day to watch the spectacle. They'd get up on the floor, they'd make these speeches. One old Southern senator was once reduced to reading the Sears Roebuck catalog in the middle of the night because he was just basically killing time. And it's the whole, I think you will all recognize the reference, Jimmy Stewart's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, all of that sort of drama that surrounded that. The right to unlimited debate, taken to stop civil rights and taken to basically stop the labor unions in the South. It changed dramatically to where now they only have to file a slip and they have to say, I'm going to filibuster this if it comes up. It only takes one senator to file that slip. And the filibuster now can be threatened, but not ever delivered. And that's what has changed so dramatically over the last, I'd say, 30 years, basically. And so that means it's become an instrument of government, and it's become an instrument that's used over and over again. Things that we don't even hear about don't come up to the floor simply because they file that one slip and that's it. And of course, that was all a part of the backdrop of the Voting Rights Act that we just had the debate last fall over, both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act, which were separate and then combined. You probably don't even remember this because 2 months ago, but Chuck Schumer promised that they were going to vote on those two acts or that one act by January the 17th, which was Martin Luther King's birthday. They didn't, and they couldn't get the vote, basically. This particular problem would not have even been relevant if it had not been for Shelby County versus Holder, which really gutted the 1965 Civil Rights Act by 5-4 majority written by the Chief Justice. Biden and the Democrats couldn't get the thing voted on because they couldn't get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema on board, and they had 50 Republicans opposed to them. So it's still sitting around, and it's still making a lot of people on the progressive side mad, particularly civil rights people, and it's still out there on the agenda. They couldn't even get to what was the middle ground that even Joe Manchin said at the time that he thought he might support, which is called a standing filibuster. That is, you got to go do what I'm doing now and hold the floor and talk. And that led to all of those great old scenes where people went on for 8 and 10 and 12 hours because they physically had to control the floor. They no longer do any of that, and it's made it super easy, in other words. The Build Back Better plan, we haven't heard much about that since Ukraine came on and knocked everything off the headlines, but behind the scenes, they've been talking about the component parts because Biden never could even get that huge bill on the floor to have a debate about it. The Senate parliamentarian said that that one is what comes under reconciliation, a significant impact on the federal budget. And because it is a significant impact on the federal budget, you can use reconciliation. And reconciliation, along with federal judges, is one of the exceptions to being subject to filibuster. Okay. So she had ruled the way Biden and Schumer and the Democrats wanted her to, and basically they could have done that one with 51 votes. But again, they couldn't get Sinema and Manchin on board. In my view, the filibuster is really the most important and most direct impediment to majority rule in this country. You get, and a number of studies have been done about this, you get a minority that often depends on a mere small percentage, almost not a sliver, but it looks almost ridiculously small number of people that are represented by the senators who can stop the debate because of the geographical distribution, because of where they're from, and because of where the threats of, and use of filibusters from. There's a great tome in my discipline. Robert Dahl wrote something called The Preface to Democracy. And in that book, he maintains that there is no excuse for supermajorities. A majority should be a majority, and that should be the definition of democracy. And outside maybe of a few super constitutional questions that have been settled for a long time, I absolutely agree with him. We can't get a vote on the big issues that face this country, and the big issues are there and they continue to be there. Just in the last 10 or so years, we've had the question of immigration stays on the agenda because we can't get anything done about it. The Dreamers Act, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with the questions of what's going on the border on the south part of the southern part of the nation? What, if anything, about federal gun control? What's the nature of our foreign policy? What's the nature of our defense policy? Are we going to do anything about inequality? What about crime control? All of those things stay on the agenda year after year and now decade after decade, and you can't get a vote on them. And the Senate, and mostly the Senate, although sometimes the House, are really the major obstacles there. So I don't have a great brief for the filibuster, as you can tell. It's a Senate rule that'll be changed in my estimation, but whether it's going to be changed is not at all clear. That depends on the outcome of the next two elections. All right, I'm going to stop with that, shift gears, and go to slide number 4, sir. Reapportionment and redistricting, another very important, sort of tedious, and a lot of technical stuff in it, but nevertheless, laws and procedures that have major impacts on our campaigns and elections. The role of Congress, the role of the president, whether we can get anything done. And partisan redistricting, I think, is mostly at the core of this. Just quickly, you probably know this instinctively if you hadn't even thought about it, but reapportionment refers to the assignment of the proper number of seats to each state in terms of how many they're going to have in the House. Redistricting is within state redrawing the district lines, okay? The number that we have is 435, got 435 voting members of the House. And then that's divided by whatever the population out of the 2020 census. That has been basically controlled by what's called one person, one vote. And one person, one vote comes out of a series of cases, Baker versus Carr, Westbury versus Sanders, and Reynolds versus Sims in the first half of the 1960s. All of those set up the requirement. Until then, we didn't get redistricting because the state legislature simply refused to do it and had refused to do it since the teens, basically. Famous case came up out of Illinois on that, for example, because Illinois for about 5 decades refused to reapportion and redistrict, or not reapportion, but to redistrict. The districts, of course, now have to be substantially equal to meet that one person, one vote rule. In this particular outcome of 2020, that number is 761,000. It's never exactly that, and how much leeway they will give you depends on the case and the judge and the court, but the shooting far goal is 761,000. It was 747,000 before that. In Illinois, not only must they be substantially equal, but they have to be compact and contiguous. They're always contiguous. They're almost never compact. Contiguous is an objective thing that you can measure. Does it all fit together on the map or not? And I want to give Illinois and others like us, there are a few others, in fact, quite like us, and that is our map doesn't look like Iowa. It's not a loaf of bread. So it's not quite as easy to get totally cynical about this because of some of the really strange and misshapen districts that you get as a result of gerrymandering. The federal law, the 1965 Voting Rights Act that I was just talking about also comes in here. We in Illinois recognized the federal law with regard to majority minority districts. That roughly is 50% of a minority group, usually African Americans and Hispanics in most cases, if they have a good chance of getting one of their own community elected to the Congress. There is such a thing as a minority influenced district. It usually is defined as 40% or above, but not 50%. So African Americans, for example, have at least a shot of getting a Black representative in the House. That's basically boiled down. If I'm wrong on that, I'll get my colleague over here to put an addendum on this, but it's a complicated area and different judges disagree on different parts of this. But at any rate, we honor it in Illinois, and most states do. But it's not honored nearly as much as it was, among other things, because of the Shelby County decision. I've got Shelby County case there, 2013 listed. There, the pre-clearance required by the Voting Rights Act of 65 was basically drastically curtailed. Department of Justice used to have to pre-clear when any of the 20 states and jurisdictions that it applied to wanted to change their electoral process and wanted to change the way it worked within the state, wanted to change significant things about the rules for counting votes and all kinds of things about when the polls would stay open. All of those things were a part of what you had to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice. The Chief Justice wrote the opinion and he said, it's not fair for these jurisdictions to still be subject to this. Times marched on, times have changed. These folks are not going to discriminate anymore. He pretty much said that it's a new day and that sort of thing does not deserve to be here. In 2019, in the case I think I've got listed there, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's Rucco versus Common Cause. That one is the partisan question of whether or not the court will put up with partisan districts being drawn. And they said yes, because they said it's not a just justiciable question. It is a political question. Now, those constitutional law folks will tell you that's a terribly important distinction they make. Will they take jurisdictions or not? It has to be justiciable. Otherwise, they're booting it back to the political authorities, particularly the state legislatures, to do what they want to. And so the court's not going to give you any help if you are really committed to getting partisan politics out of the redistricting process. So moving right along here, saving Suzanne some time.
John, if I could just add something to what you just said.
Okay.
Justice Kennedy, at least, said he would be open. Now, whether he meant that or not, I don't know, but he said he would be open to ruling on gerrymandering if he could figure out the test. So what standard would you use to decide that something was a political gerrymander versus a neutral?
That's a great question.
And nobody seems to have an answer that works in practice. You can come up with the words, but what do they mean in practice?
Well, I hope the Zoom audience, do you think they got that? What does it mean in terms of partisan gerrymandering? I'm going to repeat for the Zoom folks out there. What would be a sort of an objective measure? I'm glad you asked that. I did not plant that question. A guy named—
He's not there any longer, so.
Yeah, and Kennedy's not there any longer. There's a guy named Stephanopoulos. I don't know if he's a relative of George's or not, but he's a scholar at the University of Chicago. He and other political scientists actually have an answer for that. And it's pretty simple in concept, at least, and that is, what is the votes you got in the election to the number of seats you got in the legislative body? And there's a massive research that's been done on that. He's got the best answer to that. And he was in on the Wisconsin case. And John Roberts said, piffle, poo-poo to the who's. I don't want to mess with that. And I thought that was really the answer because, of course, he's a political scientist. I think he does good work. And it's conceptually, in operational terms, it's not simple, but conceptually, if you get 55% of the vote, you ought to get somewhere close to 55% of the seats in the legislative body. It's the ideal that that assumption adopts, okay? And we don't even get close to that in lots and lots and lots of cases. There's a big fight over it. Missouri folks here will probably recognize they've just had their map kicked back, and they went back again to what the judicial branch over there had drawn. They've got 8 House members, and they were fighting internally in the Republican Party over whether to give the Democrats one majority-minority district, and that would be in St. Louis. Some Democrats wanted another one, and they wanted one over in Kansas City area. And the argument within the Republicans was whether to give them 1 or 2. Now, the Democrats get wiped out in Missouri, but they don't get wiped out that badly. I think they lost by about 15 points to Trump in the last go-round. But that's what you get down to. That brings in the question of majority-minority, because it's where the Black vote is where the Democratic vote tends to be in Missouri. But even 2 out of 8 is pretty bad. Florida, the legislature there, in the face of a referendum where the people of Florida spoke resoundingly to put into place an independent commission, Florida legislature and governor said, well, we're not interested in that. And they ignored the referendum result, which was supposed to have been a binding result. And Florida, which is always a close state, usually a cliffhanger. I don't look up the numbers, but they've got, I think, 25, and there are about 4 of them Democrats that represent Florida in the House. And I'm sure Democrats have done. And we could talk about Illinois, which is certainly the opposite argument there. Because Democrats control Illinois, and they did the best they could for the Democratic Party. All right, slide number 5. Where are we here? Am I lost in this? Gary, are we still here? The overall result, I'm going to keep moving. As you all know, the population for generations has been moving from the south, or from the north, and from the Rust Belt, the Midwest, and the Northeast to the south and the Southwest, or the Sun Belt. The old industrial Rust Belt from New York and Pennsylvania over to the Midwest has lost population or not grown. California lost population this time, first time in a long time, but usually this is a Sun Belt sort of direction. It's unusual on the West Coast that California lost population this time, and Oregon and Montana gained population. Illinois, we continued the decline in our population, or technically we continued slow growth. We didn't actually decline, but we had slower growth. And that's been underway for the 5 decades that I've lived here. New York lost 1 seat, and they lost it by a sum total of 89 people. If they had gotten out 1 more day, or even 1 more half a day, and knocked on a few more doors, they wouldn't have lost a congressional seat. I would know a part about what people did around here trying to get SIU students and Carbondale people and Southern Illinois people, particularly NAACP, took a lead on this, trying to get them counted. And we fell pretty far short of that simply because COVID came along. Anyway, the winners, slide 5. Texas got +2. Everybody else got +1. That includes Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon, and Montana. The losers, New York, California, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and West Virginia. The projection is that will really seriously disadvantage the blue states, because all of those except West Virginia are blue states, or at least competitive. And the blue states going into 2022 are now going to be seriously disadvantaged. And red states, particularly Florida and Texas, are particularly in good shape. And in addition, as I've got listed for you there, the remap process is controlled by the Republicans in way more states than controlled by the Democrats, as the case of Illinois. I'm taking this from the Brennan Center. If you're interested in this at New York University, they've done very careful studies of this. And as they say, slide number 6, are
I've
we
lost
there?
them. I don't know what's happened to them.
We lost them. Okay, well, we'll charge along. I'm going to read you from the Brennan Center report verbatim, what we would have had on the, you may have, yeah, you do have it on your handout. All told, Republicans will have solid control over drawing congressional maps in 18 states and legislative maps in 20 states, while Democrats will have sole control of congressional maps in 7 states and legislative maps in 9 states. The single party controlled states include Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. 4 battleground states, but also 4 states where the Democrats fell far short of what they wanted to do in 2020, and the Republicans are seriously advantaged by the outcome. They go forward to say this amounts to a total control of 187 House seats by Republican states and only 75 House seats determined by Democratic bodies in those states. 167 seats are done by commissions. These include California, Colorado, and Virginia, and those are all blue or purple states, so no partisan gerrymandering supposedly going to go on there. So what does all this mean? Well, anybody who's literate in American politics, and I count all of you as certainly in that category, know that the party that controls the White House almost always loses seats in the House and Senate in the midterm elections. Now that's a whack-doodle rule, but it is a rule and it almost always happens. So what's going on there? Well, political scientists have studied that and tried to answer it. We haven't come up with really very good answers in my estimation. There are a lot of different schools of thought on this. But the one that has been adopted and that the media basically think is a red letter gospel is that this is a referendum on the president. Now, how it's supposed to be a referendum on the president when most people don't know what the president's done, what he stands for, what his policies have been, and he's only been in 18 months at this point, or whatever it is. And why is a referendum on the president? That answer is not very well worked out. I would summarize it by saying people like to vote negative. They like to vote against somebody. They like to vote to throw the rascals out. You hear that mess all the time out there. And it is a part of the way people think. And it's a fundamental part of the voting behavior research in more sophisticated terminology. And that's, to me, really about the only thing that makes much sense. And what in the world, because why are we having a referendum on the president this soon? But we take it that way. It is going to be taken that way if it goes according to the way it's shaping up. The Democrats are looking at some really pretty bad expectations for this midterm election that's coming up. It does not look good for the Democrats for the midterm election. If you want to see the end of Nancy Pelosi being Speaker of the House and on television all the time, you may well get it. And you may well get Kevin McCarthy very quickly now as Speaker. And you may well get Mitch McConnell back as the leader of the Senate and Chuck Schumer back leader of the minority for all that gets him. The average loss in the midterm elections are 25 seats in the House, 1.2 seats in the Senate. Now, all Republicans got to do is to make the average in the House, and with all these conditions I just described for you, that's highly probable, but it is not an absolute iron law. We look for iron laws in social sciences. We rarely find them in the way physics and math and others in hard sciences can do, but it's not even pretended to be an iron law because there are some exceptions. There are also some outliers in the other directions where the whole tenor of the government changed at midterm. In the case of a new president, Bill Clinton in 1994 lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And Newt Gingrich came in and his administration for the next 6 years was never the same again. 2010, Barack Obama lost the House and the Senate. And the next day he said, we took a shellacking. And his administration was never the same for the next 6 years, even though he got reelected in 12. 2014, Obama got clobbered again because it was a referendum on Obama. And the rap was the economy's not growing fast enough and people are concerned about jobs, and jobs are growing steadily, but we want them to be growing like crazy. It's remarkable to me how jobs and the job count was the only thing the media talked about that year, and they were never enough. You don't hear a word about jobs anymore. It's all about inflation, and inflation is not a friend of Joe Biden and the Democrats and all of this. The price at the gas pump is very, very much going to be the synoptic summary of how people feel about that and how they can vote about being mad. Joe Biden knows all of this, and that's why he put all of those big ticket items out there in these big, gigantic bills like Build Back America, because he knew he had 18 months, basically. He's been in the Senate 36 years. He's vice president after that. He saw what happened to Obama in 10, and he was a part of it. And what happened to Obama in 14, he remembered Bill Clinton well. He remembered Newt Gingrich well, not pleasantly, I'm sure. And he understood that. So he took a lot of heat for having rolled them up like that. He did get 2 of them at least, but he did not get some of the major objectives that he, and particularly the progressive left, wanted. So here we are in February 2022. Democrats are hoping that this is going to be an exception to the rule, and they point out quite rightly, it's a long time to November. Things can change a lot. I think that was more true before Ukraine came along. It's going to be harder to change the narrative now because there's so much more focus out there on what Biden's doing overseas. So far, he hasn't gotten the so-called rally around the flag bump that usually happens, and he needs a bump at this point. It is also true, for all that other stuff I just said, the Democrats have actually come out of the redrawing of the maps in the states, particularly some of the states where the state legislature was dominated by the Republicans. For example, North Carolina and Ohio, because of state law, state constitutions, and the vagaries of which court was it in and which federal or state and which judge. The Republicans got several maps sent back to the drawing board, or they went back to a map that had been drawn by the courts at lower level. And the Democrats came out of that better than had been expected. Certainly not enough to guarantee that the House was going to stay in their hands, but better than you would get from those numbers that I just gave you. Illinois, for example, drew a gerrymandered map and did the best they could for Democrats. If it's not a good Democratic year, those out of Chicago, downstate or deep northwestern districts that the Democrats drew that they thought were Democratic districts, particularly Sherry Boustro's district up in Moline and deep northwest, those are going to be competitive and lean Republican, even though Democrats tried to draw them as a Democratic district. And the district down in roughly a strange shaped gerrymandered district up in Metro East, going east from Metro East, that the Democrats tried to draw one that the Democrats would get. that one's going to be competitive at best. And if it's a landslide year for the Republicans, both of those districts will be gone in terms of what the Democrats thought they were getting, in my estimation. But you can take it to the bank for what it's worth. That's the way I see it at this point. It is a partisan process. However, Democrats made it a partisan process in every state they could, and New York and Illinois were two of the places where they tried to get the best prospects they could get. May not work out that well for them. We shall see. And maybe you can call me up late next fall and we can see how much my predictions were worth. All right, I've taken a lot of time and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Suzanne now. Let me get out of your way here for just a second, Suzanne, and she's going to come up
We
and,
need a quick restroom break. Do it while we switch slides here.
yeah, we got to get our act together here for just a minute. Let me get out of your way.
Take your time. Now, I love John Jackson, and I agree with 98% of what he just
That's
said.
good. That's pretty good.
But when we start talking about the courts in Illinois and redistricting, I need you to forget most of what he just said.
I never claimed to be talking about redistricting
Now-
in the courts because it
Right.
rarely happens.
So that's the point. That's the point. What he said is correct, but I'm gonna be talking about a different thing where you gotta change your mindset. So it's gonna be a challenge to all of us.
All right.
But we'll do it.
Okay. That sounds like a good rule to me.
So I think I know most people, but I'm retired from the law school. And I'm currently serving on a court committee. And I mention that now because I'm going to come back to it later. So I'm a little bit around the court system. I need a slide. So John's talked about reapportionment. And he talked about the fact that the US Supreme Court has said that when you're sending your representatives to Congress, it ought to be one person, one vote. So we have to take the nation and take the population, divide it by 435 and figure out how many people are in each congressional district. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about your legislators. I'm talking about the court system. And I'm not talking about the nation. I'm talking about Illinois. That's why I say I agree with what John was saying, but it's going to require all of us to do a slight mindset, a change of mindset. So in Illinois, let me give you a little background. In Illinois, we have a Supreme Court, okay? One Supreme Court. It consists of 7 justices. We elect them. Some states appoint them. Right now in Washington, D.C., we have a congressional hearing to appoint a new justice to the U.S. Supreme Court. So our Constitution provides for appointing justices for the United States federal courts. I'm talking about Illinois. Illinois, we elect our judges. So we have 7 Illinois Supreme Court justices, and they come from 5 districts. And you can see this on the map here. According to our Constitution, 3 of those justices must be from Cook County, i.e. Chicago. So the yellow up in the corner is Cook County, and that is where we elect 3 of the 7. The other 4, according to our Constitution, come from one of 4 districts, which according to our Constitution are supposed to be equal in population, substantially equal in population, compact and contiguous. So we use a lot of the same words John did, but we're talking about a different entity. So in Illinois, up until last year, we down here were blue. We were in the 5th district. So we elected in my lifetime, Moses Harrison, Lloyd Carmeyer, currently David Overstreet. Okay, And basically, it's I-70 across the state from St. Louis to the Indiana border with a little bit of a bump north. Okay. The fourth district was basically central Illinois, straight across the state. The third district was basically along I-80. For those of you that travel the state, it was below Chicago and across the northern part of the state. The second district was basically the purplish color up there. It was the suburbs and a little bit of northwestern Illinois. That was true until last year. Okay, so number 2, please. As I said, just to repeat, the state was divided into 5 districts. Now, I talked about the Supreme Court. The same thing is true of the appellate courts. So we have a Supreme Court, that's the top court. We have an appellate court. That's where most cases in Illinois get resolved, is at the appellate court. Only 100 or less cases make it to the Illinois Supreme Court. So most cases get resolved at the appellate court. Well, how's the appellate court? Again, those same 5 districts. So if you get convicted, where's John Pullman? We always convict John. I got it. All right, we're going to convict Harriet Simon because you know Harriet. She's been out there robbing liquor stores. So Harriet Simon is convicted of robbing the liquor store here in Carbondale. And she thinks that she was wrongly convicted and she wants to appeal. She's going to appeal that to the 5th appellate district that sits in Mount Vernon. If she robbed a liquor store in Springfield, she'd appeal it to the 4th appellate district. If she were convicted and, you know, she's pretty active. So she robbed a liquor store in Peoria, she'd appeal that to 3rd appellate district, which sits in Ottawa, and so on. And in all probability, that would end it. Okay. Most cases.
Harmless, you know, the little old lady, I can get away with murder.
See, my point exactly. Okay, so we've got these 5 appellate districts we elect. Now, in Carbondale, we would elect our just appellate court justices for the 5th, not the 2nd, not the 3rd. Okay, you get the point. All right, so moving on, please. So we have these 4 districts. They're supposed to be substantially equal. They're supposed to be compact and contiguous. Next, please. They were drawn in 1964. Many of you know we adopted a constitution in Illinois in 1970. But prior to that, this arrangement of the courts had been designed, was incorporated into the 1970 Constitution. But 64, that's when these lines were drawn. By 2010, or according to the Illinois Civil Justice League, which is a Republican leaning business-oriented group, but probably accurate, going back to John's point earlier about what's a fact, I think this is pretty close to factual. So by 2010, those lines that were drawn in 64 were out of sync. 1 in 4 Illinois people lived in the 2nd, but 1 of 10 lived in the 5th, where we live. So the population was heavier in the north, out of sync in the south. So did the Illinois legislature redraw the map in 2010, knowing that this was out of sync? No, they did not. They did last year. Why? Come back to that. So let's see what it is now, Gary, please. So now we have a new map. And now the 5th, which used to be basically here with a little bump, now goes all the way up to Champaign and Vermilion. So we had to enlarge the 5th. We knew that. We could enlarge it by going this way. We could enlarge it by going that way. We could enlarge it by going a little bit of both. The 2nd, which used to be all of this, shrunk to 5 counties. You can't see Lake and McHenry up there. shrunk to 5. Cook stayed the same. The third, which used to be all of this, shrunk to, I think it's 7. That left the fourth. The fourth grew from basically this to all the way down and all the way up. So now, if you're a lawyer, if you commit that robbery in Rockford and you appeal your conviction to the 4th Appellate Court, your lawyer, you're sitting in jail, so you're not coming. But your lawyer is coming all the way from Rockford down to Springfield to argue that case. So new lines. Next, please. Just again to make the point. So the 5th went from basically here with a little bump all the way up here. The 2nd shrunk. The 3rd shrunk. The 4th picked up everything else. Okay. One more, Gary, please. Just again, the 2nd, which used to be the suburban counties and all the way over to the Iowa border is now Lake McHenry.
Yeah.
Kane and Kendall, DeKalb,
Yeah.
where Northern Illinois University sits. DuPage, big Chicago suburban county, moved down to the 3rd. Next, please. The 3rd bureau, which you've probably never heard of in your life, LaSalle, which by the way is where Ottawa is. That's where the courthouse is for this district. Grundy, which you probably never heard of unless you go up I-39. Will, Kankakee, and Iroquois. Probably never heard of Iroquois. And DuPage. And then one more. By the way, these are not geographically accurate. I had to do a little shrinking to make things fit. So the 4th, all the way from Rockford, all the way down to Mrs. Hillsborough area, Carlinville, that area, all the way over to Quincy, Mississippi, all the way to the Indiana border is the 4th. And as I said before, that's the 5th. Okay. Just to drive home the point a little more. You can go several slides up, Gary. We will. Okay, stop there. So Cook County is still Cook County. Constitution says it needs 3. That's the same. The 2nd went from 13 counties to 5. The 3rd went from 21 counties to 7. The 4th went from 30 counties to 41. The 5th, where we are, went from 37 to 48. How does that work out in terms of substantially equal? And here I have to, one more, Gary. I have to correct it. When the Democrats drew this, they used American, I forget what ACS stands for.
American Community Survey.
Thank you. So there was a big debate in Illinois throughout last year about the data that the Democrats were using. They should wait for the census data. They didn't wait for the census data because, as you remember, that was late because of COVID and everything else. I say here, I used census data. The Dems used ACS data. They have since amended their bill before it made final passage and used census data. The difference was a hair for this purpose. Okay, so there was no significant difference. So now Illinois has 12.8 million people. The 1st elects 3 justices. Cook has 5.2 million. If you divide by 3, it's about 1.7 million people per justice up there. The 2nd now has 1.8 million. The 3rd now has 1.9 million. And we have about 1.8, 1.7 in the 4th and 5th. So it's substantially equal. So what does this tell us? And Gary, if you will go back a couple, please.
Oh,
Can you go back?
yes. How far? You want a map? You want?
Right here.
Okay.
5/7 of the population of Illinois lives right here. 5/7 of the population of Illinois lives in Cook, the green, and the, I guess that's purple. 5/7 of the population of Illinois is right there. Okay. Now you can go back to observations, please. So the population has either moved north, or those of us in the south and the central have declined, or both. Interestingly, I found a chart with the population of Illinois from 1960 and then 2020. We are about what we were in 60, but we went up and then down in the 5th. So people have either moved out or they've moved north. If you're a lawyer, as I said, in Rockford, you're going to travel down to Springfield. If you're in Champaign, you're going to travel to Mount Vernon now for your appellate hearings. Judges are going to be elected from a wider section of the state for the 4th and 5th. Those of us in the 4th and 5th are going to be further removed, I think, from the people that we're electing to the Illinois Supreme Court or the Illinois Appellate Court, because it's so much bigger. There's going to be names we've never heard of, probably. And if you want to run for office for the appellate court in the 4th or 5th, you're going to have to campaign in 41 counties or 48 counties versus running in the 2nd, where you can campaign in 5 counties. How many people want to run for office in 41 and 48? How many pancake breakfasts and fish fries can you go to in Greene County and Grundy County, Greene County and Menard County and the others? Now, just because we elect judges in Illinois, we elect them on a basis of a party platform, a party designation. Cook County has been 3 Democrats for all my life, and I assume will probably be 3 Democrats for the rest of my life. The Chicago suburbs, which used to be the 2nd, was GOP dominated. The 3rd kind of changed back and forth, but most recently for the last 20 years was Democratic. The 4th for the last 20 years has been GOP. When I was younger, when I first became a lawyer, it was Moses Harrison was Democrat. Then it was Lloyd Carmeier, and now it's David Overstreet, so it has flipped. Does that make any difference? Now I'll let you think about that for just a moment. Now, what I've said so far is fact. I'm going to give you his opinion. I want you to understand it's my opinion, because if you decide to sue me for slander, I probably will win if it's my opinion and I'm not representing it to you as fact. So this is opinion, okay? Very important that you remember that. All right, 2 slides up. So what's it going to look like? This map was drawn by the Democrats. There was no legislative hearing. No legislative hearing. A map was put out, everybody threw a fit, slight amendments, it passed. The only thing I haven't heard from the Republicans is it was drawn up in the middle of the night, which is a term they often like to use, but there were no legislative hearing. There was little, if no, involvement from the court. The court was surprised. Okay. So it is widely believed that the Democrats redrew the 3rd to be Democratic. They took DuPage County, which is turning blue, traditionally was red, turning blue, they moved it to the 3rd. General belief that the 3rd will now be Democratic. The Republicans believe that the 3rd is 51% Republican, 49% Democratic. We'll find out in November. But the Democrats believe they drew it to be Democratic. The 4th is probably going to stay GOP for the near future. The Dems believe that there's a chance that the 2nd will turn blue, because Lake, which is the largest county in the second, has been leaning blue. And I'll show you in a minute, they think there's a chance in the fifth, but it's likely going to stay Republican. Now, why? So I told you before that since 1964, when these were drawn, things got out of sync. At least by 2010, we knew they were out of sync. Did the Democrats wake up one morning and say, gosh, we have nothing to do today. Let's redraw the Illinois court districts. Good idea, let's do it. It's widely believed, remember, this is my opinion, it's widely believed that the Republicans wanted to get rid of Justice Kilbride in the 3rd district. And Ken Griffith, Republican big donor from the Chicago area, who just gave $20 million to Richard Irvin to run on the Republican primary for governor. The same Ken Griffith, this is my opinion again, remember, gave a ton of money, I'm forgetting the number, to defeat Justice Kilbride III. Remember, our justices on the Illinois Supreme Court are elected for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they stand for retention. To be retained, you need 60% of the vote. Interestingly, according to our Constitution, to be elected, you need 50% of the vote plus 1. To be retained 10 years later, you need 60%. In the 3rd, last year, 2020, Justice Kilbride got 56%, not 60%. He was defeated. Widely believed by many people was Ken Griffith's money. Why did Griffith want to change that? Some people say he just wanted to change the makeup of the Illinois Supreme Court as a whole, thought that 3rd was a good place where he could flip from Democrat to Republican. Others believe that there was that people were upset with Kilbride because there had been an effort, you may remember, to get a fair map amendment through, where we were going to have all these lines that John talked about drawn by fair map people, not by the politicians. And that issue went to the Illinois Supreme Court. It was defeated on a 4-3 vote. Kilbride wrote the opinion, killing it. So some people think was anger there. My impression of Justice Kilbride is he was a darn good judge. And it's interesting, he says that he came from the type of background that would not be the good old boys network. He would not normally have made it through the ranks and be party supported. He started out with legal services, legal aid to the poor, not a background that most people that make it to the Illinois Supreme Court start off with. I thought he was a pretty good guy. Doesn't mean I like him all the time or I agree with him all the time, but I thought he was generally pretty good. But there was an effort to defeat him and it won. So were the Democrats saying, aha, you think you're going to turn the 3rd red? We'll redraw it to make it Democratic. My opinion. Others can disagree. So go ahead, John, Gary. Does it make any difference when it comes to the courts? And I've been practicing law in what's now the 5th Appellate District and still is the 5th Appellate District since 1981. I took the bar exam on the day that Charles and Diana got married. It was a great distraction because you're so nervous the night before the exam. So watching all the fireworks and excitement of the wedding was a great way to take my mind off worrying about the bar exam. But that's when so I've been practicing law since 81. Does it make a difference? In most cases, no. If we've got the evidence to prove that Harriet was out there robbing those liquor stores, it's probably not going to make any difference. But on some cases, yes. Generally, labor and the Illinois trial lawyers support Democrats for judge. Generally, business interest and to some extent the banking, realtor, medical communities supports Republicans for Chet. So they seem to think that on some close call cases, at least, it does make a difference. We've not had a lot of culture war cases in Illinois, but that would be another place that would make a difference probably. On some close call cases. So Harriet says, you know, you violated my rights when you arrested me. Sometimes those kind of constitutional rights cases might make a difference in the way, because frequently these are close call cases. And you could make darn good arguments on either side. So maybe there it would make a difference. Place that it does make a difference is in filling judicial seats. So I told you we elect judges. Sometimes a judge gets sick and has to resign, dies, it's vacant, or decides to retire early and it's vacant. Judge Grace, Chuck Grace, from us, from right here in the First Circuit where we are in Jackson County, retired in December. His seat was empty. How do we fill that? Well, we can wait for the next election, which is what we're doing in Judge Grace's case, or the justice from that appellate district can fill it. So if, because we're in the 5th, Justice Overstreet's Republican, he could fill that seat. Would he fill it with a Democrat? Maybe. Would he fill it with a Republican? Probably. But I want to tell you, and Judge Grace is an example. Justice Overstreet did not fill that seat. He's waiting until the election in November. I personally think it's the better way to do it. Rather than fill the seat and give someone an advantage of running in November as Judge Schmitz. It's empty, and anybody who's running could run for that seat. So there are probably a Republican would have a better chance of getting us of filling a vacancy in an empty seat, a vacated seat in the 5th than a Democrat. But I'm going to tell you, last year, I believe it was, or 2 years ago, recently, there was a vacancy in Union County. Justice Overstreet did what Justice Carmeier used to do, which was appoint a committee of local lawyers to vet the applicants. He appointed me. I was one of 6 people on a committee. We interviewed the candidates, we discussed them, and we recommended a name to him, and he appointed that person. Those of you that know me could guess that Justice Overstreet, as he does know, that I was probably not in the Republican category, but I was on the committee. At no time during the day that we interviewed these people did anybody ask anybody's politics. Maybe nobody applied who wasn't a Republican. I'm pretty sure that the other people on that committee knew who was and wasn't. But we did not discuss it, and I'm convinced that we chose the right person, the best candidate of the applicants. So, yeah, makes a difference. But I don't want you to go away thinking it's absolute. Something we don't always think about is there are tons, and I'm obviously using that word very casually, but there are a bunch of committees and commissions that the Illinois Supreme Court has that makes all kinds of recommendations. And here's one that just got approved this week. During the pandemic, the courts held Zoom court. So rather than shut down and have everything wait, and poor Harriet sitting in jail for months and months waiting for her trial because she's pled not guilty and she can't come up with the money for the bail, they proceeded. They did a lot of stuff by Zoom. What the court locally in Jackson County has found is that more people showed up for traffic court, for landlord-tenant court, and for small claims court because they did it by Zoom than showed up when they did it in person. Because people have to work. And if they think they're going to be found guilty on traffic, or they think they're going to be evicted anyway, why show up and lose a day's pay? Or have to get somebody to drive them there? Because of Zoom, they showed up.
locally, and I'm only talking Jackson County because I've talked to the judges here, they're pretty happy with it. And maybe you don't want to try Harriet for a crime by Zoom, but traffic court, small claims, landlord, tenant, yeah. So a committee has just been appointed by the Illinois Supreme Court to look into doing some of that on a permanent basis. Who they appoint could make a difference. More importantly, bail reform has been a major issue. Legislature has been involved in it. There's a real problem in Cook County with cases not getting tried and people sitting in jail for a long time because they could not afford bail. And then after they've sat in jail for 18, 20 months, the prosecutor dismissing the charges. Here's the story. I'm the state's attorney of Cook County. I've got way more cases to try than I have people to try. So Harriet gets arrested. She sits in jail. We don't have time to try her. It's a misdemeanor. After she sat there about 12 months, we say, oh, well, dismiss the charge. She's effectively served the sentence without ever being convicted. That was going on in Cook County. Remember, this is my opinion as to what was going on in Cook County. Well, 2 years ago, John, was it that the Black Caucus in Illinois General Assembly put together a crime package, crime reform package last year, and it passed. And a lot of it was directed at bail reform. Now, there are people who will say, just because it's a problem in Cook County doesn't mean it's a problem in Jackson County. So again, when the court, even though that went through the legislature, the court is looking into mental health issues. They are looking into bail reform. They're looking into all kinds of other issues that affect the justice system. Do we want only Republicans? Do we want only Democrats? Does it make any difference? I leave that to you to decide whether you think it makes a difference. I will tell you that I've been appointed to the Illinois Board of Admissions, the bar. We oversee the bar exam. People that seek to become a lawyer in Illinois, we oversee that. There are 7 of us. 1 appointed by Justice Overstreet, 1 appointed by Justice Gorman IV, and so on. 3 appointed by the justices in Chicago, 1 each. Do you think we ever talk about, gosh, that person ought to pass the bar exam because it's a Democrat, or ought to fail because, no. The good news is we never know anybody by name. We only know them by a number. So that never comes up. So I don't want you to go away thinking, gosh, the Illinois Supreme Court is so political, it's all politics. It's not. I'm here to tell you it's not. But am I naive enough to tell you politics doesn't make a difference? No. So one thing I learned from this, let me see what the next slide is, Gary. Oh, go one more. Sorry, can you back up to a map?
Okay, which one? This one? No,
The big one.
the new big one?
Yeah,
Like
that'll be
this
fine.
one? Yeah.
Perfect, thanks. So one thing I've learned is that the Democrats are as good as Republicans at gerrymandering. Okay, because they drew this. Okay. Or are they compact and contiguous? Well, they're contiguous. Do you consider this compact? Are they now substantially equal? Yeah, they are. But was this designed with a specific purpose in mind? Probably. So that's one conclusion that I draw from this. Here's a few other little petty observations. The justice for the 4th is Rita Garman. She's from Vermilion County. See where Vermilion County is now? It's in the 5th. If she runs for retention, she's going to have to move to the 4th.
Oh.
Now, how hard is that? Well, how long would it take me to find an apartment in Springfield to rent as my new home? So it won't be hard. but she's a Republican. And just coincidentally, Vermilion County went down here. There were some vacancies on the court. And when there's a vacancy on the court fills the vacancy. So Bob Thomas had been a justice in the second appeal. And there was a vacancy, so the court filled it with a guy by the name of Mike Burke. Mike Burke is going to run for the second. Except he's from DuPage and he's now in the third. Okay. So there has been a complaint by the Republicans, and they say that something like 4 out of 6 judges that are either up for election or retention in the next couple of years are going to have to relocate. Is that one of those petty things the Democrats did just because they could, or was it a coincidence? I don't know. You can make that decision. So let me pause there and take comments, questions, criticisms. Yeah, Marcia.
What is the influence of the governor in choosing the Supreme Court? Does he have any say so at all?
No, not in Illinois.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to see if there's any other questions. So I'm going to come back to yours because you just raised an issue dear to my heart. But in Illinois, we elect the governor, the legislature, 0. Okay. Other questions, comments? Beth? So did I see a hand there? Or no.
No, but is electing them a good thing? I don't feel as if I have enough information when I vote for them.
Well, you're tying into Marcia. I'll come back to that. Jan.
I seem to recall in the past year, some judge from here was sent to Chicago to spend time on court. Is that a common practice to?
Not anymore. It used to be that the courts in Cook County were so busy that every circuit throughout the state sent judges to Chicago for a couple of weeks to hear cases. They did not hear big ongoing cases. They heard traffic court, housing court, things that were done in a day. That gives rise to Brockton Lockwood from Marion, who went to Chicago and figured out the bribery scheme that was going on called Operation Greylord. And he wore a wire, if you remember, in his boot and was able to get people on tape offering money. The reason for sending people from downstate to Cook County was they were too busy up there. There was too much work to do. And in view of some, not enough work down here. We don't do that anymore. I don't know why not. Is it because there's, yeah, thanks. Is it because they've got more judges elected in Chicago and the burden has decreased? I don't know. All right, well, let's take up this question.
No, Stephen Kraft has a question.
Oh.
What is the role of money in the election of judges?
Well, okay, so these 3 questions all lead to the same thing. In Illinois, we elect judges. We elect the Supreme Court, we elect the appellate court, and we elect circuit judges. We also have associate judges. They're appointed by the circuit judges. Governor and the legislature, nothing to do with it. You know, in contrast, and you see it right now going on with the US Supreme Court congressional hearings on the US Supreme Court nomination. In the federal system, the president, according to the US Constitution, the president appoints judges with the advice and consent of the Senate. So when there was a vacancy on the US Supreme Court, the president chose Ms. Jackson. She is current Judge Jackson. She is currently being considered by the Senate. If confirmed by the Senate, she will be on the US Supreme Court. Missouri does something a little similar, but a little different. Missouri has what's called the Missouri Plan. Why is it called the Missouri Plan? I assume because they were the first ones that came up with it. So the Missouri Plan is in a number of states and it works like this. The governor appoints, but he appoints from a committee, from a list vetted by a committee. So the governor appoints a committee in every circuit. So we right here in Jackson County are part of the first circuit. There are, I think, 9 counties here. We're the first circuit. So under the Missouri Plan, if we had it, there would be a committee appointed. And when a vacancy came up in the first circuit, the committee would interview applicants, would give the governor 3 names. The governor could choose from those 3 or send it back to be redone, and the Senate would confirm. Some people think that's a better way. The committee could be made up only of lawyers, or it could be lawyers and citizens. Depends upon how you want to set it up. The idea being that the committee is local, better understands what it means to be a judge in that county or that circuit, and would be better than citizens who go through that whole list on the ballot and get to the bottom, and I got to choose a judge, and I don't know. Now, so that's one argument for what's called merit selection, select the judges on the basis of merit. The other argument for that goes to Steve's question, which is money. There is a belief, well, I think it's a 2-part question. It's politics and it's money. Let's take politics. Will you get politics out of the process? Not in my lifetime. So in Missouri, if the governor sends word down to those committees, I want women, I want minorities, I want Republican-leaning business people, I want people who've had experience as prosecutors because we need to reform crime. My point being, the governor can influence who it is that the committee is going to select by who they put on the committee and by the message they send as to the type of judges they want to see. You eliminate politics. Why is it that we spent yesterday letting how many senators on that committee?
22.
22 people speak for 10 minutes each about their view of the court, other than politics makes a difference, even though we're not elected. So I don't think you're going to avoid politics, but maybe you change it and it's not just, is it a Dem or a G? Or I guess I meant. The second issue is money. So can we get money out of it? I used to say, yes, we could. I used to say that I thought that at least it won't look like we're buying judges. You know, we won't have, and to run for judge in 48 counties, do you know how much money you're going to need to put up signs in 48 counties, or to drive to pancake breakfasts in 48 counties so that you can run for office? You need some money. And if we don't want only rich people running for judge, then they're going to have to go get money from somewhere. There's going to be campaign donations. And I used to think that at least we'd get rid of that if we had merit selection. I'm not so sure anymore. How much money is being spent right now in Washington, D.C. by people who are supporting Judge Jackson or people who are opposing Judge Jackson? I don't know how much money, but more than I've got. And if we look at the appellate justice retention election in 2020, where Kilbride was defeated, he got $500,000 from Madigan, and that was one of the things used against him. But I think it was $2 million that Ken Griffith spent to defeat him. So we're going to get money. Steve, we can decrease the amount of money if we do merit selection, but we've got merit selection in the federal system, and look at how much money is being spent in DC right now. The reality is, I think less money would be spent But one of the things that saddens, when I started out, I really believed in our system, and I really believed that merit selection was a good idea. I'm in the League of Women Voters, and we're on record as supporting the merit selection system for electing judges in Illinois. I used to be a member of the Illinois State Bar Association. I just refused to pay dues to go to Chicago, so I don't belong anymore. I don't have any philosophical difference with them. I just am cheap and don't want to spend the money. The Illinois State Bar Associations had a long time stand of being in favor of merit selection of judges in Illinois. So I used to really think that would at least take care of money. I've, in my old age, becoming
More realistic or more cynical.
John suggests that I'm becoming more cynical or more realistic. Maybe it's some of both. So in Illinois, whether or not to paint the walls of this room red or green could become a political decision on which money would be spent. So I have just a couple more things to say, but other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
There has been changing of boundaries for judicial roles, for voting, for school boards. Even some of the communities in Metro East have merged. Has that ever happened for counties or states, that the boundaries have changed, or they've combined or split apart?
I'm not aware of the counties changing since
We were admitted to the union.
in 1821.
I doubt, you rarely get that, Steve. You get sometimes city-county consolidation, as in Nashville, Davidson County, for example, but counties don't disappear with maybe one or two minor exceptions.
And that years ago, when there was that kind of at least there was a slogan that Southern Illinois should secede from Illinois and form its own state. That's just a.
Oh, that's still alive and well, but that's a different question.
But that reminds me, in drawing these maps, the legislature was required not to split counties. So they had to keep counties intact. But we have counties that are 3 million people, and we have counties that are 5,000 people. One last thing, and this is, yes.
Well, over 100 years ago, I mean, there were splits in counties as the state was being developed in the 1800s.
That could very well
Oh,
be.
yeah, no, it is. I mean, there weren't any counties in the north because it was all settled
Right.
down here. And there are various counties that have been split into 2 counties, but that's been 100 years ago, just because of population.
Certainly since the 1970
Right.
Illinois
Oh, no, nothing
Constitution,
like
there's been no
recent.
change.
It's a long time ago.
Okay, let me go back to factual, since I know you're voters. And the primary is in June, and you are going to have some judges on the ballot. So I thought I would just give you a purely informational, and this is purely informational announcement as to what to look for. So the very second last. Second last. Okay, so there is going to be a vacancy in the new 5th district. And you will elect somebody in the primary in June and in the election in November. There is no primary for Democrat. There's one person running, and that's Brian Roberts. There is a contest on the Republican side, and that is between Barry Vaughn and Mike McCaney. Brian's from here. Barry Vaughn is from somewhere, McLeansboro, somewhere in that area. So certainly downstate. McCaney's from around Centralia, in that area. So we don't yet have people running from Champaign. I will tell you, in the future, you're going to see people running from Champaign, Vermilion County, which is Danville, that area. But for right now, the people are running are people that we might be more familiar with. So that's for the 5th appellate district. What about for the trial court, the local judges? One more, Gary, please.
Oh, I'm trying.
I'm glad to see that I'm not the only one that has.
There you go.
So I told you that Judge Grace retired right at Christmas time. We need to fill his seat. There'll be 2 candidates, so for the primary, you don't have to worry. If you're a Republican, Christine Hines will be running. Democrats, Ralph Bloodworth, he's known as Boomer Bloodworth, will be running. Judge LIR vacancy, Steve Bost is running, no Democrat is running. For the Judge Boyd vacancy out of Union County, Timothy Denny is running, no Democrat is running. Now, we're in the First Circuit, okay, which is about 9 counties. This position, what had been Judge Blier's position, all 9 counties, I think it's 9, will vote for this position. The Illinois Constitution says every county must have a judge. It's called a resident judge. Judge Timmy is now the judge in Union County. He's running to keep that seat. The only people that will elect him are Union County. The position that Judge Grace had is a Jackson County position. Only those of us in Jackson County will vote for either Christine Hines or Ralph Bloodworth. Bloodworth is now a judge, Boston is now a judge, Denny is now a judge. So just not a lot to worry about for the primary unless you're a Republican in the appellate court, but give you a heads up for the November election as to who's running. John?
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate it. I think I agree with 100%. If you have questions, I think I want to save those and we'll start next time with anything that you want to tag on to what I said. Just hang on, make a note on your handout, and I'll be back with you next week and we'll start over again. So thank you all for coming out, and it's quit raining.